So we're gonna get into In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, and we're gonna talk about it in relation to the nature versus nurture debate. And it's specifically interesting to talk about Perry Smith, who was the one who did the murders, who killed the Clutter family. And Smith is interesting because when we think about his upbringing and how Truman Capote presents him to the readers, it seems like Capote has a special sort of sympathy towards Smith that he doesn't have for Hickok. And maybe this is because he actually, he knew them both personally, but he seemed to have a closer relation to Smith. And it seems when reading the book like Capote wants us, as the readers, to ask ourselves whether Perry Smith was just evil, cold-blooded killer, or if his childhood and his very bad conditions might have been a reason for why he ended up how he was.
I think that's a very interesting point, and if we look at page 245 from the book, Smith is explaining what happened the night of the Clutter murders, and he also mentions that Hickok was about to go and rape Nancy, the young girl, but then Smith stopped him. And then Hickok says, "Why do you care? Hell, you can bust her too." And to this, Smith then becomes very upset, and he also explains that he hates people who cannot control themselves sexually. And what is deeply interesting here is how Capote is presenting this scene, because he is not just reporting the facts, he is also reconstructing a dialogue between these two men, and he is giving us readers insight to the emotions of Smith and also his moral reasonings. And what is very clear about the scene is that it's an example of new journalism, because we're not just told what happened, but we're also getting into the thoughts of Smith, which makes the scene much more personal. And I think it's a very strategic writing method by Capote.
Yeah, it's definitely something Capote does on purpose. And when you were talking about the scene where Hickok is like wanting to rape Nancy, I thought about how it's kind of interesting the fact that Perry, who literally kills these people, still has this moral idea that rape is wrong. And what I kind of thought is, if he has the moral compass that you can not rape but you can kill, isn't that an argument for nature over nurture?
I get your point, but I don't know if it's necessarily an argument for nature versus nurture. Maybe his moral code is just very inconsistent. Maybe his rejection of sexual violence comes from his own upbringing, or maybe even his head injury. I think that's a factor that you can look into.
Yeah, and also something I noticed while reading the book is that throughout the whole story, Smith definitely sees himself as morally superior to Hickok, which might be how he justifies the killings, because according to himself, he didn't necessarily intend to kill anyone when they entered the Clutter family house, whereas Hickok was most likely premeditated, and he was prepared that there would be a bunch of people and that they would probably have to kill these people. So it's just really interesting to me how Hickok, the one with the objectively better childhood, was the one who came up with this murderous plan. And yeah, these characters are just really interesting because it feels like they speak for different sides of the argument. Like Perry Smith's childhood upbringing and head injury, as you mentioned, suggests that he maybe, and I agree with you, was nurtured to be this way, while Hickok, who had the better upbringing, to me, it seems like it's nature. Like he is more so just a bad person than Perry Smith from the beginning, from nature's side.
I do get your point. I really do. I think if we circle back to how Capote chooses to portray these murders in the book, he actually had a very bad and troubled childhood himself. And I thought while reading the book that maybe he sees himself in Smith. I think that's what the case is here. Not that he would murder a whole family, because we clearly know that he didn't.
Yeah.
But or anything like that. But maybe he chooses to portray Smith with sympathy, as I also said before. I think it's very it's his intention to portray him this sort of way because he can relate to him at some level. I think maybe in a relation in life, or that they spend a lot of time together. So maybe he started to he got a more deeper insight to him as a human being and his thoughts and also his childhood. And I think when you spend time with someone and get to know them, you also get to know them at a deeper level. And yeah, maybe he also felt very sorry for him, and that's what his intention was in the book, that he could see himself in him, and he also wanted people to see him as much more than just a murderer or a criminal. This was a man who also had a very bad childhood and upbringing, and that's some factors that caused him towards these evil actions. That's what I think.
I agree, but I think that's actually one of my main issues with the book, because I just think it's always going to be morally problematic to write a book about killings if you feel sympathy for the murderer, or if you relate to the murderer. But I think just in general, I don't really agree with the true crime genre.
Yeah, I think overall that Truman Capote, he seems to believe in nurture over nature. And I also think that this was the fate of Hickok and Smith. And it's also very clear that because they had a bad and troubled childhood themselves, that was something that did not make them want to do better in life. They actually had a downward social mobility, and instead of doing something with their life and becoming better, they actually became worse. And that's also a bit interesting if we take a look at the text Coming of Age in Samoa by Margaret Mead, which is an ethnographic study of Samoan youth culture. She responds to this nature versus nurture debate.
Yeah. And obviously Margaret Mead, she believes that the Samoan youth experiences adolescence as overall happier than the American youth. And this is because she believes in nurture over nature, that the environment forms people. And I'm really curious about, also I'm interested to know what you think. What would have happened if Hickok and Smith had grown up in Samoa and not America?
Oh, that's a good question. And also I don't think that's a fair question.
Oh.
Yeah, to be honest, because I think, I think it's a bit hard to compare them to Samoa, because when Margaret Mead, she wasn't actually studying murders, she was studying young girls. And already there's a difference. But I do believe that Hickok and Smith might as well have turned into murderers if they lived in Samoa. I don't think that the place is doing something different. I think it's very problematic to put the blame of their actions onto their environment and remove the blame from them, because if the blame is not on them, that must mean that it is nature. And that is the reason for their actions. So it isn't their fault that they're killers. That's what I think.
But I do think that realistically it has to be a mix between nature and nurture, which Hickok and Smith is a pretty good example of, as we've discussed.
Another interesting text to look at that is also related to the text about Samoa and In Cold Blood is Silent Spring. And specifically the way Carson opens up the book. She opens up the book with a perfect and harmonious environment, a town that's in the heart of America where everything seems perfect. And she is just really describing the nature very positive. And it is also describe like the American dream just in a visual form, I would say, because everything just seems perfect, just the way that we would imagine life would be if the dream was accessible for everyone. Yeah.
But the key takeaway might just be that the American dream, as we discussed before, isn't realistic for everyone. And just like it was shattered for the Clutter family, it also was just never even a possibility for Hickok and Smith.
Yeah, and I think just in overall, it's interesting to see that in Carson's case, it's about nature, how well she describes the nature positive, and then everything is just flipped upside down. And that's the same thing that happens with the Clutter family. Everything is just flipped upside down. And I think the similarity between these two texts is that Carson's case is about nature, and Capote's it's about human lives.